reviewing Autism and Asperger's Syndrome in Children by Beardon. So we talked about how if the environment is not suitable, the outcome will often be anxiety. It is the combination of being autistic in a non-autism friendly environment that leads to anxiety, not being autistic per se, which is why not all autistics are anxious. But again, I disagree with him here. I say, yes, environment has a massive role to play, but the reason why not all autistic people are anxious, although I'd say that actually the majority of autistic people do experience a greater level of anxiety if they're normal. I notice this just because I go to quite a few autism groups, and most of the people at the groups I go to are anxious to at least some extent. Maybe not all of them are as anxious in a crippling extent I am, but it's a very common bedfellow more often than not. And quite a few of them are medicated for it as well, so I would say that it really does depend on the individual. For some, it is actually part of being autism, or part of being autistic in terms of at the biological level. It's a felt physical experience. It's as much a part of biology and chemistry as the sensory issues are for some people. And like I say, obviously the environment has a massive role to play. I'm not by any means underestimating the role of environment. Environment can make the anxiety bearable, or it can make the anxiety absolutely intolerable, but a background level of anxiety just does seem to be the norm for most autistic people. Sure, there are going to be some lucky autistics who don't have the extra disadvantage of being anxious, but they do seem to be in a minority, from my experience, for people I've met. He says that there is nothing within an autistic brain that would mean a person susceptible to psychiatric illness. Again, I disagree. He really does seem to be here over-egging the social model. And I'm a fan of the social model. I do think that is very progressive, and I do agree very much with the social model. But I do think social model extremists sometimes live in this kind of utopia kind of land where they kind of deny the biological reality of mental illness. And psychiatric difficulties, whether or not they lead to illness or not. I don't feel mentally ill, but I do struggle with my mental health, and that's because I'm blessed, I'm being ironic here, with just a brain that just is very anxious. I do think that my autism itself, like I've said, does make me, the way my autistic brain is configured, does actually also result in my anxiety. That's just a felt thing. My whole being is full of neurotic anxiety. That's just how it is. It almost implies, what Luke Beardon saying, that it almost implies like if I was put into some utopia, I don't know what that utopia would be, but I would somehow suddenly be cured of my anxiety, and I don't see that happening because it's so deeply embedded within my DNA. So I disagree with him there. I just think he's being too optimistic. And he's not autistic himself either, so he's speaking from the other side. Maybe he needs to come inside my head and see what it's like, and then he can talk. He talks about the nature of autistic anxiety, how autistics often get stressed from the moment they know something's going to happen, however distant that might be in the future. Can relate to that a lot. And how the environment could be part of the issue, for example, visiting a cousin. He talks about how anxiety-inducing situations need to be understood and systems put in place to alleviate them. Quiet space for yourself. He talks about change, how autistics are often resistant to specific types of changes, but not generally averse to change. So they're often resistant to anything that would upset what he calls their global stability. So I guess it's interesting, and I do agree with him here. I really struggle with change, but I don't struggle with all types of change. It's a bit of a myth that just because autistic people, on average, struggle with change, that every single change is going to be aversive. For some that might be the case, but often it's very specific types of change that are the issue. So, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't really think of a specific example here, but I'm trying to think on my feet. But I generally find that for myself, big changes, sort of all-encompassing changes, where things are changing so totally, are actually easier for me to process than little changes. This might sound a little bit paradoxical, because you'd think that surely bigger changes would cause more stress than so-called small changes. But actually for me, I do find it easier to process big changes. Maybe it's because they're so final, there's something total about them, all encompassing. You can't, a big change is kind of, it's like a status quo shift, but I'm not quite sure why I find them easier to process. Whereas small changes are things, for example, a small change might be, for myself, that my breakfast gets delayed, or something stops me getting up at a particular time, or going to bed at a particular time. So these small changes are actually what cause me the most extreme distress and are most likely to trigger a meltdown. Whereas a huge change, maybe a bit like the COVID situation, I'm not saying I'm coping with the COVID situation because I'm finding it really bloody hard, but it actually triggers less meltdowns for me than little changes that would mess up the kind of microcosm of my daily routine. The microcosm of my daily routine is what I need to function. Mess with that at your peril, because it will trigger a meltdown. But big changes, I can actually find it easier to kind of process. And I don't quite understand why that is, but do let me know. Because, because people often think, when they think autism, that we're going to like really struggle with every single change, but it's often very specific changes that are most often linked to our interests and our daily routines that we can find the most aversive. Again, it's a bit like with noises and other sensory input. It's not the case we're going to find all sensory input equally aversive, because there are so many different contextual factors at play, and this again can confuse people. Autism is complex, but let me know what you think. Yeah, man, I struggle to understand a lot of this myself, and I'm living with it, so no wonder non-autistics find it hard. He talks about how most non-autistics, the predominant neurotype, have stability in their life. They have what he calls global stability, so they rarely have to worry about how to socialise or understand what is going on around them. But these are unstable for autistics. So the average non-autistic does not need to worry about minor changes. But the autistic is in a state of constant chaos. Life stability is likely to depend on a very few elements. So that's why he says that it's often the small changes that could be most aversive, which is very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense to me, actually, this explanation. He says it's very little that autistics can rely on to provide a sense of stability. So things that do provide stability are a bit like a poor person's very last pound. They're incredibly important, because you need those little tiny details to provide the just a tiny little modicum of stability in a really chaotic world. So we cling on to these tiny little parts of our routine because they provide that sense of stability. So how would most people react if the stability is massively interrupted and whipped away from them? Because everyone relies on things to give their lives stability. It's just that for most people, their lives are not quite so chaotic. Because their lives are not quite so chaotic, the clinging is not quite as intense, because their lives are less chaotic. The more chaotic your life is, the more you cling to routine. And that's the case for non-autistics too. As I'm sure now with the COVID situation, even non-autistics are probably getting more obsessive and things like that, because that's kind of a normal reaction to stress and chaos. But in autism, it's magnified. He says how others might not necessarily understand because the changes might appear trivial to them, but everyone is resistant to changes that disrupt their stability. And obviously, the more unstable your lives are, the less things in your life are stable. The things that are stable are the things that make up your routine. That might seem trivial to other people, but there's a few things you can rely on in a really chaotic world. So obviously, when they're messed with, now your world is totally chaotic. There is nothing that you can rely on anymore, and you're completely adrift. So that's this explanation for why autistics often really go crazy, if you like, go absolutely ballistic when our routines are meddled with. But I just thought that was a very interesting explanation. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to carry on reviewing. I've just got a bit more to talk about in next week. So thank you for watching.